I am Martha, 70 years old, and on the very day I said goodbye to the husband who had been with me for nearly my entire life, I received a phone call that still sends chills through me whenever I think about it. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I looked at the screen. Mr. Caldwell, Henry's boss, a man I had only met a few times at company events. His voice was deep, each word sharp and deliberate. Mrs. Martha, you need to come to my office immediately, alone, and don't let anyone in your family know about this. I froze in the middle of the church. The scent of lilies grew heavier with each person passing by. Henry lay in the casket just a few steps away, yet here I was, being told by someone else that there was something he wanted me to know, something that I was the only one allowed to hear. I clenched my handkerchief. There was something Henry had left behind, something important enough for a man like Caldwell to speak up and to tell me to keep it from my own son. Before I continue, if you're following this story, leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Every time I learn that my story has reached someone far away, I find a little more strength to share what so many others have lived through as well. The church was more crowded than I expected that day. Henry's old friends, co-workers, neighbors, everyone came to say goodbye. I sat in the front row, yet it felt as if I were standing outside looking in, as if the funeral no longer belonged to me. Evan, my son, stood at the entrance, shaking hands, directing people to place their flowers, telling them where to sit. Jesse straightened the tablecloths and instructed the servers on arranging pastries and coffee. They handled everything without asking me, not because they were thoughtless, but because they acted as though they were the ones who had suffered the most significant loss. I watched Evan from afar, tall, steady, sometimes even a bit too stern. I remembered when he used to cling to my hand whenever he was scared, and the way he would hide behind me whenever strangers came to visit. Time truly has a way of quietly reshaping people. Then I overheard Jesse whisper to an older woman behind me, "Poor Martha. She's been very weak lately. Her memory isn't what it used to be." I heard every word, even though she spoke softly. I turned my head slightly. Jesse was still wearing that gentle smile, the kind that I could no longer tell was caring or pitying. I wanted to respond, but my throat tightened. People believe the younger ones more easily. I was just an old woman who had lost her husband. When guests came to offer condolences, they went to Evan and Jesse first, speaking with them and comforting them. Very few talked directly to me. Some placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Take care of yourself." I nodded, forcing a smile. But inside, I felt as though I was being pushed away from the role of being Henry's wife. After the service, I sat in the small room behind the church, the one Henry liked to stop by to make coffee during community meetings. Evan walked in, his voice sounding more occupied than caring. "Mom, we'll handle the rest of the paperwork. Don't worry about anything. Just rest." Jesse followed him in and set a cup of tea on the table. "Here, Mom, you must be tired today." I looked at the tea. I didn't remember asking for it, but Jessie had been making decisions for me more and more lately. She sat beside me, placing her hand on mine in a gesture meant to comfort, yet something about it felt off, as if every touch was meant to remind me I was weak and needed direction. In that moment, something became clear. Ever since Henry collapsed and left me, my place in this family had shifted. Evan and Jessie had slowly taken over everything, even the things I never asked them to. I couldn't tell whether their intentions were good or not. All I knew was that being treated as someone who no longer had a voice in her own life hurt more than the grief of losing my husband. A day after the funeral, the house fell quiet again. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the familiar dining table where Henry and I used to talk every morning. But today, the chair across from me was empty. No more muttering about quarterly reports or asking what we should have for dinner. I was lost in thought when Evan and Jessie arrived. They didn't knock for long, Just pressed the doorbell once and stepped right in, as if the house had belonged to them all along. Evan sat across from me, fingers interlaced. Jessie stood behind him, resting her hand on his shoulder. They exchanged a glance before Evan began. "Mom, we've talked it over. This house is too big. It's not safe for you to live here alone, especially with your health." I frowned slightly. "I'm fine. I'm just grieving your father." Jessie sat beside me, her voice soft, almost like she was soothing a child. "We understand, Mom, but look at these places we found. They're very comfortable. There are nurses on duty, staff to clean, activity areas. You won't be lonely. You'll have friends your age, too." She opened her phone and showed me glossy photos of a luxury senior living center. Older adults playing cards, doing light yoga, laughing over breakfast. Everything looked peaceful, but to me it felt like a life sealed inside a box, stripped of freedom. I pressed my lips together. I haven't thought about that. Evan leaned forward, keeping his tone gentle, though I could hear the insistence beneath it. "Dad just passed. You shouldn't be here alone. What if something happens to you?" Jessie quickly added, "And your memory hasn't been good lately. The other day you misplaced your blood pressure pills." I was really worried. I stiffened. I remember leaving them on the kitchen shelf. Jessie laughed softly. "No, Mom, I found them in the cabinet under the sink. You forgot." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words stalled. I was certain I hadn't put them there. But if she said so, had I really mixed it up? Doubt crept in. Evan looked at me with an expression tinged with pity. "Mom, we just want what's best." My throat dried. A part of me wanted to believe they were genuinely concerned, but another part sensed something was wrong, not with their suggestion, but with the way they presented it. Everything seemed already planned, as if they were simply waiting for me to agree. I looked around the house. The kitchen, the windows, Henry's favorite chair, the bookshelf he once repaired. Every corner held pieces of our lives. The thought of leaving all this behind hollowed me out. "Let me think about it," I said, keeping my voice steady. Evan and Jessie exchanged a quick glance, one that carried a hint of dissatisfaction. Jessie squeezed my hand lightly. "Think quickly, Mom, so we can start the paperwork." When they left, the sound of the door closing made the room feel emptier than usual. For the first time, I wondered, were my feelings real? Or was I truly losing myself, as they said? That evening, the house felt far too quiet. I sat alone in the living room, listening only to the steady ticking of the wall clock, as if it were reminding me that time continued onward, even though half of my life had just disappeared. I tried to read the note Evan and Jessie had left, a list of the senior homes they wanted me to consider. But the more I looked at it, the heavier my heart felt. Those facilities seemed complete, comfortable, even luxurious. Still, they lacked the one thing I cherished most, the freedom and space I had always shared with Henry. Suddenly, the phone rang. Mr. Caldwell's name appeared on the screen. My heart pounded. I answered immediately. His voice was low and firm, exactly like it had been at the funeral. "Mrs. Martha, I need to remind you again. Please do not tell Evan or Jessie about our meeting tomorrow." I gripped the phone tighter. Why? What is so serious that my own son can't know? He remained silent for a few seconds, as if choosing his words carefully. "Henry prepared information he wanted you to receive. He instructed me to give it only to you if the worst were to happen." I froze. "He said that?" "Yes. And he made it clear that you must hear the truth without any influence from anyone else." Worry seeped into every breath I took. Henry was not a suspicious man. If he had felt compelled to leave such precise instructions, then he must have discovered something unsettling. But the more I thought about it, the more it hurt. Henry should have shared this with me. Why had he kept silent? Why had he prepared everything alone? Caldwell continued, "Please come here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. I will explain everything." Mr. Caldwell. Can't you tell me a little now? I'm very confused. I understand, he replied softly. But the matter is complicated. Discussing it over the phone could put you in danger. A chill ran down my spine. Just one sentence, yet it sent my thoughts spinning. Danger? To me? From whom? I blurted out, "Does this have anything to do with Evan and Jesse?" There was hesitation on the other end. "Tomorrow you will understand. Trust me for one more day." The call ended, leaving the house even heavier with silence. I stood and walked around the room, trying to steady myself, but one question echoed relentlessly in my mind. Why would Henry hide something from his own son? I looked up at our wedding photo on the wall. Henry, in his deep blue suit, was wearing the gentle smile I had loved all my life. Suddenly, hot tears slid down my cheeks, not only from grief, but from a rising sense of dread. Perhaps Henry had been trying to protect me in a way I never saw coming. I set the phone on the table and told myself to stay strong. Tomorrow I will meet Caldwell. Whatever the truth was, I needed to know it. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because my mind refused to rest. I put on the deep blue coat that Henry always said suited me. When I looked in the mirror, my face seemed older than it had just a few months ago. But beneath the weariness, I also saw determination. The downtown road wasn't far. When the Sterling and Caldwell Financial Building came into view, it felt like stepping into a world entirely different from my modest kitchen. The building was covered in glass, gleaming almost blindingly. I took a deep breath and walked in. The receptionist guided me to the 18th floor where Caldwell's office was. When the elevator doors opened, the scent of polished wood and the faint hum of the air conditioner drifted out. The office was spacious, with large windows overlooking the city. Everything made me feel small, though not threatened, just unfamiliar. Caldwell stood waiting at the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Martha. Please come in." He didn't waste time. He motioned for me to sit in front of his desk, then placed a thick folder on the table. "I know coming here is difficult," he said, "but Henry wanted you to know everything." My hands trembled slightly as I rested them on the folder. Caldwell opened it. Inside were pages of notes in Henry's handwriting, interspersed with printed emails, photographed documents, and sheets bearing legal seals. Caldwell spoke slowly, each sentence clear. In the last 6 months of his life, Henry suspected that Evan and Jesse were pressuring him to sign documents transferring control over finances, medical decisions, and property. I blinked hard. No, Evan wouldn't do that. He just has a temper sometimes. But Caldwell continued, gentle yet unwavering. Henry recorded several instances when Evan met him privately, specifically when you were not home. Jesse also sent him documents via email, saying they needed to prepare for your future. I stared at Henry's handwriting. He had written everything in detail. Evan keeps bringing up Mom's weakness, claims she isn't clear-minded anymore. Jesse brought a draft of the POA. I feel cornered. The more I read, the tighter my throat became. I wanted to find a reason, any reason, to defend Evan and Jesse. Maybe they were just worried about me. Maybe they thought Henry needed support. I looked to Caldwell, hoping he would tell me this was all a misunderstanding. Instead, he placed another document in front of me, a copy of the power of attorney Jesse had prepared. Henry's name and mine were already filled in. Only the signatures were missing. "Henry brought this to me 3 months ago," Caldwell said. "He refused to sign. When he did, Evan became angry and accused him of not thinking about your future." I couldn't speak. Inside me, something twisted painfully. A conflict between believing my husband and believing my son. Caldwell went on. "Henry feared you would be put in a position where you couldn't make your own decisions, so he started gathering evidence. That's why he asked me to speak to you if anything happened." I lowered my head. It was too much to absorb all at once. but deep inside, I knew Henry never acted without reason. And this time, his reason was apparent. He had been trying to protect me. Caldwell flipped to the next section of the file. The pages he placed in front of me were no longer Henry's notes, but concrete evidence, things an ordinary person could not fake or explain away with a few gentle words. He set down a small cluster of keys. "Do you recognize these?" I looked closely. They were my house keys, the same set I thought I had lost 2 months ago. I remembered it clearly. I had searched the kitchen, then the living room, and finally ended up using the spare set. Jessie had looked at me with sympathy and said, "It's okay, Mom. Forgetfulness is normal at your age." I believed her and spent the whole afternoon blaming myself. Caldwell opened a small envelope. Inside was a photo of those keys inside Jessie's car trunk. My heart felt as though it were being pulled downward. Not painful, just heavy. He continued. Henry hired someone to follow them discreetly, only to confirm his suspicions. From the folder, Caldwell pulled out more photos. Jessie is collecting my mail and slipping it into her purse instead of bringing it inside. A bank envelope opened before reaching me. Evan is standing at the reception desk of a clinic, rescheduling my appointment without telling me. I felt as if someone were slowly peeling back the layers of my life, forcing me to see everything I had overlooked. "You see," Caldwell said quietly, "they aren't attacking you directly. They're creating the impression that you're becoming confused, and every time you question something, they have a reasonable explanation ready." I stayed silent. All the times I'd found things in the wrong place, forgotten an appointment or failed to receive a bank letter, each had made me believe old age was catching up too quickly. But it turned out everything was arranged, not a coincidence. Caldwell placed another document on the table, stamped by a medical institution. This is a pre-written diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment. The doctor who signed it is a Dr. Kingsley, someone Henry had never met. My eyes widened. I've never seen that doctor in my life." "That's correct," Caldwell said. Henry knew, and he discovered that Dr. Kingsley was someone Jessie knew personally. This document was prepared as the basis for placing you in a senior facility under guardianship. Once labeled mentally incompetent, you would lose control over your finances. I leaned back in my chair, feeling my body grow lighter while my heart grew heavier. Everything was too neat, too well-timed, too perfectly aligned, just like a carefully constructed plan. "I know this is shocking," Caldwell said gently, "but Henry didn't want you to spend the rest of your life in doubt and under someone else's control." I looked back at the file, then lightly touched Henry's handwritten notes. Every line, every stroke carried his worry, his vigilance, and his fear that I would be left unprotected. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. Henry saw danger approaching long before I did, while I still believed our family was just as peaceful as before. I was still staring at the documents when the office door suddenly opened. Evan and Jessie walked in, their faces tense. I jumped to my feet, startled. "Mom, why are you here?" Evan demanded, his voice sharper than usual. Jessie hovered closely behind him, her eyes darting over Caldwell's desk. "You shouldn't be meeting strangers on your own right now. You're still not well." I didn't have a chance to respond before Caldwell stood up, maintaining a calm demeanor. "This is a private meeting between Mrs. Martha and me. I'm going to have to ask you both to leave." Jessie let out a soft, strained laugh. "Mr. Caldwell, you don't understand. She's been very sensitive lately. We're her family. We know what's best for her." My hands tightened under the table, part fear, part anger at the way they spoke, as if I had no mind of my own. Evan stepped toward me. "Mom, come home with us. This place isn't good for you." I opened my mouth to speak, but it was clear they had no intention of listening. Evan gently took my elbow as if to lift me up, but before I could move, a cough echoed from the small room behind us. I froze. So did Evan and Jessie. Caldwell looked toward the door. I think it's time." The door opened slowly. A man stepped out. Thinner than before, hair messier but his face unmistakable. My legs nearly gave out. Henry. My husband, the man I had seen lying motionless in a casket, was standing right in front of me, alive. I lifted a trembling hand to my mouth as tears flooded my eyes. "No, no, Henry. It can't be." My voice shook so much it barely formed words. Henry walked toward me and held my shoulders. "Martha, I'm sorry. I never wanted you to go through these past days, but it was the only way I could protect you." I collapsed into his arms, chest aching with overwhelming emotion. I cried without sound. After believing for days that we had lost each other forever, everything had reversed in a single heartbeat. Evan stood frozen. Jessie's breathing grew rapid, and she nearly dropped her handbag. "Dad, what?" Evan tried to speak, but his voice trembled violently. Henry kept one arm around me and looked directly at them, an expression far different from the gentle patience he once showed his children. "I am alive," Henry said slowly, "and I faked my death because of what I discovered." I stayed close to him. His familiar warmth was the only thing grounding me. Henry explained, his tone steady and unmistakably clear. "I asked an old friend, a doctor, to help me simulate temporary cardiac arrest. The funeral home used an unclaimed body donated for medical study. I left the city and stayed at Mark's cabin for 2 weeks to avoid being found." I turned to Henry, torn between relief and heartbreak. "You had to do all of that because of them?" Henry nodded slowly. I didn't want to believe it, but what I found was undeniable. I was afraid that if I did nothing, you would lose control over your own life. Evan took a step back, his face draining of color. Jessie stared at the floor, gripping her purse so tightly it looked like she might crush it. For a long moment, the room was swallowed by silence. I held Henry's hand, feeling the faint tremor in his fingers. Even though he always appeared strong to the world, I knew the past months had taken a toll on him too. And when I looked at Evan and Jessie, I realized something I had never allowed myself to consider before. The truth was now exposed, and there was no way to return to how things once were. No one in the room moved for several long seconds that felt like minutes. The tension was so thick that even the slightest sound could have shattered everything. Henry placed his hand on my back, gentle but firm, as if to steady both me and me. He walked to the desk and opened his leather briefcase. Evan watched every movement, fear and anger mixing in his eyes. Henry took out a black USB drive. "I want us to listen to this first." Caldwell plugged it into the computer. A recording began to play, Evan's voice coming through clearly. "If Dad signs, everything will move faster. Mom's weak already. She's not as sharp as before." Then Jessie's voice followed. "I already talked to Magnolia Place. All they need is the medical file and the signatures. The sooner we do it, the sooner she'll adjust." At the end of the recording, Evan said a sentence that made my blood run cold. "Once Dad's gone, everything will be easier." I pressed a hand to my chest, struggling for air. Evan immediately stepped toward me, snapping, "It was just a way of talking. It doesn't mean what you think." Henry didn't argue. He motioned to Caldwell, who placed another stack of papers on the desk. "I think you should see this," Caldwell said. They were photos of Evan at a poker table, stacks of chips in front of him. The pictures were taken on different days. Below them were notes documenting the amount of money he had lost. Jessie swallowed hard, her face draining of color. Henry laid out a few invoices next. "These are the charges Jessie made using Martha's membership card to buy jewelry. None of them has your signature." Jessie burst out, "That's not true. It was just a mix-up." But the explanation was far too weak to stand against the evidence laid out before us. I looked at Evan. "Say something." He avoided my eyes. I needed the money. I thought I could borrow it temporarily. You have plenty anyway." Henry looked at his son, sorrowful but firm. "No one has the right to take even a single dollar from your mother. without her consent. Caldwell placed another sheet on the table, the fabricated diagnosis from Dr. Kingsley. I shook my head. I've never been examined by that doctor. Henry said, Jesse asked him to prepare the file. If you were placed in a nursing home under guardianship, they would have full control. Jessie shot to her feet. I just wanted her to be taken care of. I met her gaze directly. By taking away my right to decide for myself. She didn't answer. She only turned her face away. Evan bowed his head, his hands clenched tightly. I thought you wouldn't understand. I thought it made sense. You and Dad don't need much money anymore. Each word from my son weighed heavily on my heart, not because of the money, but because he saw me as a solution instead of a mother deserving respect. You once told me, I said slowly, that as long as you were healthy and happy, I would have peace. And yet today, you calculated what would happen when I died. Evan didn't reply. Jessie stood with her arms crossed. Her face had lost the polished expression she always wore. With everything falling apart, she no longer bothered to hide. We didn't do anything wrong, she said coldly. Martha, can't you see? You're getting older. You forget things. You forget appointments. You can't live alone. I didn't feel angry, just sad. Jessie, I forget some things. Who at my age doesn't? But I know what I'm doing. I know who loves me and who doesn't. Jessie pursed her lips. Right. You always think you're right. She drew in a sharp breath. We just wanted less pressure. Evan is drowning in debt. We needed a fresh start. You and Henry have everything, and we have nothing. Henry stepped forward, voice low but steady. You could have asked for help. You could have spoken openly. But you do not have the right to take another person's freedom and dignity. No one has that right. Jessie looked at Evan, waiting for him to defend her. But Evan simply sighed and closed his eyes, as if surrendering to everything. I studied my son for a long moment. In his eyes, I saw the shadow of the little boy who once clung to me during thunderstorms. But that boy had grown into a man who didn't know how to face failure, and instead of standing up, he leaned on his parents as a way out. Evan, I said gently but firmly, I've forgiven you many times in your life, but this time is different. You didn't just hurt me. You tried to make me believe I was losing my mind. He trembled. Mom, I'm sorry. I shook my head. Sorry can't erase what you and Jessie did. The air in the room grew colder. Henry placed a hand on my shoulder. We've tried giving them chances, but from today on, we have to protect ourselves. I took a deep breath and looked straight at Evan and Jessie. From now on, you are no longer a part of my life. Jessie exploded. You can't do that. We're family. Henry answered for me. Family is not defined by blood. It's defined by how we treat each other. Evan looked at me one last time. In his eyes, panic flickered, then hardened into bitterness. He said something that nearly made my knees buckle. Maybe this is better. I'm tired of pretending to care. His words cut through me like ice, and yet they also clarified everything. I said simply, then go. Evan and Jessie left the room. The door closed softly but decisively, and in that moment I knew the bond between my son and me had shattered completely. Evan sank into a chair, his elbows propped on his knees. He stared at the floor as though every excuse he'd prepared had been stripped from him. I had never seen my son like this. No confidence, no insistence that he knew what was best for me. Only exhaustion and confusion remained. I called softly, Evan. He lifted his head, eyes red. Mom, I never meant to hurt you. I was cornered. His voice cracked. I owed more than you knew. Jessie and I tried everything. I thought, if you and Dad had extra, helping us a little wouldn't matter. His words made my heart ache, not because of the money, but because my son saw me as a resource, not a mother deserving respect. "You once told me," I began slowly, "that as long as you were healthy and happy, I could be at peace. And yet today, you were planning around the moment I died." Evan bowed his head again. Jessie stood with her arms crossed. Her face no longer carried the polite grace it had always worn. With everything collapsing, she made no attempt to hide anymore. "We didn't do anything wrong," she said coldly. "Martha, can't you see it? You're getting old. You misplace things. You miss appointments. You can't live alone." I didn't feel anger, only sadness. "Jessie, I forget a few things. Who at my age doesn't? But I still know what I'm doing. I still know who cares for me and who doesn't." Jessie tightened her lips. "Fine. You always think you're right." She inhaled sharply. "We just wanted less pressure. Evan is drowning in debt. We needed a new start. You and Henry have everything and we have nothing." Henry stepped in, his voice low and steady. "You could have asked for help. You could have been honest. But you do not have the right to take someone's freedom and dignity. No one does." Jessie looked to Evan, waiting for him to back her up, but he only sighed and closed his eyes, as if accepting everything. I studied him for a long time. In his tired features, I could still see the little boy who once hugged me tightly whenever he was afraid of thunderstorms. But that little boy had grown into a man who couldn't face failure, and instead of rising, he chose to lean on his parents as a way out. "Evan," I said gently but firmly, "I've forgiven you countless times, but this is different. You didn't just hurt me. You tried to make me question my own mind." His voice shook. "Mom, I'm sorry." I shook my head. "Sorry can't undo what you and Jessie did." The room grew colder. Henry placed a hand on my shoulder. "We gave them chances, but from today forward, we have to protect ourselves." I drew a long breath and looked directly at Evan and Jessie. "From now on, you are no longer part of my life." Jessie barked. "You can't do that. We're family." Henry answered before I could. "Family isn't just blood. It's how we treat each other." Evan stared at me one last time. Panic flickered in his eyes, then hardened into resentment. He said something that nearly made me lose my footing. "Maybe this is better. I'm tired of pretending to care." His words sliced through me like ice, but they also cleared away any final doubt. I said simply, "Leave." Evan and Jessie walked out. The door closed with a soft but final thud, and I knew at that exact moment the bond between my son and me had shattered beyond repair. After the confrontation at Caldwell's office, the situation did not immediately come to a resolution. The truth reached beyond family hurt. It touched the law. Henry and I both knew that if we stayed silent, the same thing could happen again, this time to another victim. A few days later, Caldwell called. "Mrs. Martha, Henry, I have forwarded the entire file to the Financial Crimes Investigation Unit. This is no longer just a family matter." I sighed softly. Even though I knew it was the right thing to do, my heart felt heavy. No one wants their child entangled in the law, even if the child's wrongdoing is real. 2 weeks later, I received a notice from the authorities. They wanted to meet with me to clarify some transactions. When I went, they presented what they had found. 3 credit cards opened in my name, signatures forged but sophisticated, more than $10,000 spent on luxury goods, small but regular transfers from my savings account to an account linked to Jessie, and notably, falsified medical records that could constitute fraud aimed at obtaining guardianship. I listened to each item, clutching a tissue tightly. The investigator looked at me gently. "You are not at fault. You are the victim. Many elderly people are financially abused without even knowing it." I nodded. For the first time, I truly understood that this was bigger than a family tragedy. It was a warning to people like me. One afternoon, Caldwell came to my house to give an update. He said, "Jessie's nursing license has been suspended by the board. Her involvement in the falsified records is a serious violation." I felt a nameless sorrow. Even though Jessie had mistreated me, I still felt pity for her life, a young person who could have built a future through kindness. But everyone must be held accountable for their choices. A month later, the case was heard in the local court. Henry and I were present, our hearts heavy. The judge read the evidence aloud: financial fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy to seize property through falsified records. Evan stood before the court, shoulders slumped. I looked at my son and felt a sharp ache, like someone pressing on a wound that had never healed. Finally, the judge pronounced, Defendant Evan Harris, 18 months of probation, mandatory financial supervision, and 200 hours of community service. I breathed out, though not entirely relieved. Henry took my hand and said softly, At least Evan has a chance to make amends. Henry's faking of his death was a legal issue. Still, when all the evidence of the abuse against me was presented, the judge said, You acted wrongly, but your motive was to protect your wife. You will face an administrative fine and perform some community service hours. Henry accepted without a complaint. I looked at him and felt quietly proud. When the trial ended and we stepped out through the large doors, I looked up at the clear blue sky. Though my heart hurt, I felt as if an old dark door had been closed. Ahead of us were years left to live, this time without any lurking fear at our backs. After all the upheaval that lasted months, Henry and I decided to leave our old city. Not to run away, but to start over in a place without painful memories or corners that reminded me of the days I was made to doubt myself. We went to Willow Creek, a small town a few hours' drive away. The place has tree-lined streets, wooden porches on small houses, and the peaceful sound of birdsong in the morning. The first time we arrived, I felt lighter, as if a burden I had carried for too long had been lifted. Henry chose a red-roofed house at the end of town. The backyard was just large enough for him to plant a rose garden, the thing he had talked about for years but never had time to do. On the first morning, I sat in a wooden chair on the porch, watching Henry plant each rose bush, gently tending to the tender stems as if caring for something precious. He looked up and smiled. Here, we'll plant our life again, Martha. I smiled back. The words were simple, yet they warmed my heart in a strangely comforting way. No traffic noise, no arguments, no hurtful words, only a soft breeze and the scent of fresh earth. During the early weeks, I allowed myself to rest more. In the mornings, I made tea, opened the windows, and let the sunlight in. Occasionally, Henry would hand me a dew-kissed early-season rose. For you, he would say, because you deserve to live gently. I realized it had been a long time since I'd lived for myself. For an extended time, I had prioritized being a mother and a wife, trying to care for everyone else. I had forgotten that the elderly also need respect, to be listened to, and to have a voice in their own lives. In Willow Creek, I relearned simple habits: cooking the dishes I liked, reading in the afternoons, and jotting down my tangled thoughts into a small notebook. I began to feel alive again. Our neighbors were Brenda and George, an older couple about our age. They knocked on our door one Saturday afternoon carrying a warm apple pie. Brenda smiled brightly. We often gather on weekend afternoons. If you two want to join, you're always welcome. I looked at Henry and nodded. It had been a long time since I accepted an invitation, but this time I wanted to give it a try. The gathering was warmer than I imagined. We sat in their backyard listening to George talk about gardening, while Brenda asked me how I made the raisin bread I used to bake for Henry. I felt as if I was stepping into a new circle of safety. No pressure, no calculations, no judgment. That night, as we prepared for bed, Henry took my hand. Martha, I think we're finding the rhythm we should have had long ago. I nodded gently. There were times I was afraid I wouldn't get back up after all that happened, but here I feel like I can breathe. Henry pulled me close. What matters is that we still have each other. And I knew it was true. Despite loss, despite hurt, despite having to let go of part of our family, we still had hands to hold through the hardest days. One early autumn morning, as golden leaves covered the front porch, I heard the footsteps of the mailman approaching. He placed an envelope on the step and greeted me with his usual friendly smile. I bent down to pick it up and froze the moment I saw the familiar handwriting. Evan. My son's name was written neatly in the corner, in the same style he used on the Mother's Day cards he once made for me. My heart tightened, a mix of emotion and fear. It had been months since we cut off contact. I wasn't sure whether I was ready to open it. Henry stepped outside and saw me standing still. "What is it, dear?" I handed him the envelope. Henry looked at it and gave a slight nod. "I think it's best if you read it, but if you're not ready, you can set it aside." I took a deep breath. "No, I want to know what Evan is thinking." I opened the letter. "Mom, I don't dare call because I know you don't want to hear my voice right now. I'm writing this not to ask for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. I just want you to know I'm trying to change." I paused, feeling a soft ache in my chest. Henry placed a hand on my back without saying a word. I kept reading. "After the trial, I started attending therapy as required. At first, I only did it because I had to, but then I began to see things more clearly. The doctor said I've always believed I was entitled to whatever I wanted, that I placed my burdens on others whenever I struggled. I didn't think I was like that, but the more we talked, the more I realized he was right. I wasn't as mature as I thought I was. I hurt you. I betrayed you and Dad in a way I can't understand anymore." My eyes stung. I sat in the wooden chair on the porch, and Henry sat beside me, waiting for me to continue. "Jesse and I are divorced. We blamed each other, but the truth is we were both wrong. The biggest mistake was believing that everything you and Dad had would someday be mine, that I didn't need to stand on my own. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I just want you to know I'm trying to become a better man. If you choose to give me another chance someday, I promise to prove myself through actions, not words. I love you. Evan." I folded the letter and placed it on my lap. A breeze swept across the porch, carrying the scent of damp earth from last night's rain. I didn't know whether to feel sad or relieved. My emotions tangled together. Henry asked softly, "How do you feel?" I looked at him. "Evan is trying, but I can't go back right away." Henry nodded. "I understand. Forgiveness is one thing. Allowing someone back into your life is another." I looked out at the garden where Henry's roses were just beginning to bloom. I said, "I want to live the rest of my life peacefully. If one day Evan proves he's truly changed, I'll reconsider. And if not, I'll still live well." Henry took my hand. "You're stronger than ever." I gave a small smile. I'm simply choosing what feels right to me. That afternoon, I sat alone in the living room, looking at Evan's letter lying neatly on the table. The late afternoon sunlight fell across the paper, softening the words. I was no longer angry, but I couldn't erase the memories of everything that had happened. Henry walked in and set a cup of hot tea beside me. "I think you're deep in thought." I smiled faintly. "I'm just wondering what family really means." Henry sat down beside me. "Maybe family isn't always the people who share our blood. It's the people who choose respect and kindness over their own interests." I looked out the window at the roses blooming evenly. I used to believe that unconditional love for your child meant they would return it in the same way. But the truth is, people grow up, and everyone makes their own choices. I rested my head on Henry's shoulder. "Sometimes I feel like I failed as a mother." Henry shook his head gently. "You didn't fail. You raised him with everything you had, but you can't live his life for him or make his choices, and you certainly can't absorb every wound just to preserve a relationship that no longer has respect." I closed my eyes, letting his words sink into my heart. "People think that when parents grow old, they don't need to be heard anymore," I said quietly. "But the truth is, the elderly need respect even more. They need to feel they still matter, that their voice still counts in their own family. Henry held my hand. Exactly. Old age isn't a time to be pushed aside. I remembered the days when Evan and Jesse gently reminded me that I had misplaced something or forgotten something. The pitying looks that I now understood were manipulative. They never shouted at me or struck me. But making me doubt my own mind was far more frightening than any direct insult. I think many people are like me, I said. They trust their children so much they don't see the manipulation. I hope anyone hearing my story knows they're not alone, and that they have the right to stand up for themselves. Henry smiled kindly, and the right to live the rest of their life the way they want. I looked out at the garden again. Since coming to Willow Creek, I felt a little lighter every morning, maybe because I no longer lived in fear, no longer heard words that hurt me. I lived for myself again, and for the man who had always protected me. Respecting the elderly, I said slowly, isn't an obligation. It's the moral foundation of any family. A family that loses that is just an empty house. Henry smiled and brushed his thumb across my hand. And you understand that now, Martha. That's the first step to peace. I nodded. I've learned that sometimes, to save your own life, you must let go of people who no longer see you as family. Outside, a soft breeze rustled the rose petals, carrying a gentle fragrance. I felt my heart settle again, this time for real. That evening, I sat on the porch holding a warm cup of tea. The air at Willow Creek felt gentle, the breeze carrying the scent of newly opened roses with every breath. Henry was watering the plants in the distance, his light jacket lifting slightly with the wind. The peace of the scene quieted my heart. I thought about the past year, the loss, the betrayal, the wounds I thought had no bottom. I thought about the day I stood in front of Henry's casket, believing I had lost my life partner. I thought about the moments when Evan made me question my own mind, and then I thought about the moment Henry stepped out of that small room, alive, holding my hand again. Everything changed in an instant. Now, sitting in the calm of our new life, I had one wish, that our remaining years would be gentle, free from the fear of being controlled by others. We chose to live for ourselves, and it was the best decision I ever made. Henry carried a second cup of tea and sat beside me. Was today a good day? He asked. I smiled and leaned my head on his shoulder. Much better. I feel like I'm living again. Henry took my hand, his thumbs brushing lightly across the back of it. We've been through so much. Now we just enjoy what we have left. I looked at the fading light settling over the hillside, feeling weightless. You know, Henry, I've never felt as free as I do now, free from fear, from the need to justify my life to anyone. He gave a warm smile. Because you finally understand you deserve that freedom. We sat like that for a long time, needing no more words, only the wind, the soft sound of water in the garden, and the quiet peace filling our breaths. Then I turned to him and whispered, almost as a reminder to myself, tomorrow will be another new morning, and we'll live fully without letting the past bind us anymore. Henry nodded. There is only the present, and you. I smiled, feeling certain that whatever years we had left, few or many, they would truly belong to us. And if you've stayed with me until this moment, I would like to express my deepest gratitude. Thank you for walking with me through my life story to the very end. Please leave the number 7 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And if you enjoy real stories, gentle, meaningful slices of life, follow the channel so we can continue sharing and listening to many more together. I'll see you in the following story, where we'll sit down again, open our hearts, and tell each other about life.